The desert wind swept across the battlefield, carrying with it the whispers of an empire on the brink. As the sun's first light spilled over the plains of Gaugamela, it revealed a scene of breathtaking contrast, an ocean of Persian warriors, their ranks stretching beyond sight, glittering like molten gold under the rising dawn. War elephants, their tusks painted in battle colors, stood motionless as their riders muttered ancient prayers. Scythed chariots gleamed, their blades poised to carve chaos into the Macedonian lines. At the center of this storm to come stood Alexander. His white-plumed helmet caught the light like a beacon, his gaze steady, his presence unshakable. He turned to his men, a force dwarfed by the enemy but unyielding. When he spoke, his voice cut through the tension. Calm, yet charged with purpose. We do not fight for survival today. We fight for immortality. Across the battlefield, Darius III sat in his gilded war chariot, a symbol of the vast empire under his command. The immortals flanked him, silent and menacing. His generals leaned close, their whispers urgent, but his focus never wavered from the figure in the distance, the young king who had already defied the might of Persia twice before. Doubt coiled in his mind, unspoken but undeniable. He had prepared this battlefield, assembled the full power of his empire, but would it be enough? This was their third and final clash. The stakes were nothing less than the fate of civilizations. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as the armies moved into formation, the lines between life and death drawn in the sand. Join us for the epic tale of the Battle of Gaugamela, where Alexander the Great and Darius III clashed in a fight that would shape the fate of empires and echo through history. No man becomes great by accident, Aristotle once told his young pupil Alexander, and history would prove these words prophetic. Born in 356 BCE in Pella, Alexander emerged from the shadows of Macedonia's royal court, bearing the weight of two powerful legacies. Through his father, Philip II, he inherited a transformed Macedonia, a kingdom that had evolved from a backwater region to a military powerhouse. Through his mother, Olympias, he claimed descent from the legendary Achilles, a heritage that would profoundly shape his self-image and ambitions. The Macedonia of Alexander's youth was a realm in transformation. While other Greek states viewed Macedonia as a barbaric backland, Philip II had been quietly building something revolutionary. Gone were the days of tribal warfare and loose alliances. In their place stood professional armies, innovative military tactics, and a unified vision of power. Young Alexander watched as his father balanced military might with diplomatic finesse, learning lessons that would later define his own reign. But it was Aristotle who would truly shape Alexander's mind. When the philosopher arrived at Mieza to tutor the young prince, he brought with him not just knowledge, but a whole new way of seeing the world. Under the shaded walkways of the school, Alexander and a select group of noble youth, many of whom would later form his elite command staff, gathered to learn from one of history's greatest minds. They studied not just warfare and politics, but poetry, ethics, and the natural world. Alexander particularly loved Homer's tales of heroic deeds, often staying awake late into the night reading the Iliad. These weren't just stories to him, they were blueprints for greatness. While other princes might have been content with theoretical knowledge, Alexander burned to put his learning into practice. By 16, he was already leading troops into battle. His father, recognizing his son's talent, gave him command of Macedonia's elite companion cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea. It was here that Alexander first demonstrated his tactical brilliance, leading a decisive cavalry charge that broke the legendary Theban sacred band. The victory sent shockwaves through the Greek world. Macedonia was no longer a frontier kingdom, and Alexander was no ordinary prince. But fate had greater challenges in store. In 336 BCE, Philip II was assassinated during his daughter's wedding celebrations. In an instant, the 20-year-old Alexander found himself king of a vast realm, teetering on the brink of chaos. Southern Greek cities, sensing weakness, prepared to rebel. Noble families within Macedonia began plotting, questioning whether this young prince was fit to rule. The empire his father had built seemed ready to crumble. Alexander's response revealed the leader he would become. Within days of his father's death, he moved with lightning speed to secure his position. Those who underestimated him, expecting a cautious regency or a period of consolidation, found themselves facing a force of nature. When Thebes and Athens began stirring talks of rebellion, Alexander force-marched his army south with such speed that he arrived before many cities even knew he had left Macedonia. The sight of his army appearing seemingly out of nowhere, led by this golden-haired young king in gleaming armor, was enough to shock most cities into submission. But it wasn't just speed and force that marked Alexander's rise. It was his ability to inspire. Unlike traditional Macedonian kings who ruled through fear and force alone, Alexander created something new. A brotherhood of warriors bound by loyalty and shared vision. His companions weren't just soldiers, they were partners in his dream of empire. Men like Ptolemy, whose strategic mind complemented Alexander's tactical brilliance, and Hephaestion, whose diplomatic skills would prove crucial in managing conquered territories, became more than just generals. They were the instruments through which Alexander would reshape the world. As he secured his position, Alexander began preparing for something even greater. His father had dreamed of invading Persia, but Alexander saw this as merely the first step in a grand vision. He began reorganizing the Macedonian army, combining the disciplined phalanx infantry with mobile cavalry in ways never before seen. He studied Persian customs and governance, preparing not just to conquer but to rule. He sent scouts across the Hellespont, gathering intelligence about terrain and forces. Every detail was meticulously planned. By 334 BCE, when he finally launched his Persian campaign, Alexander had created something unprecedented, an army that combined the discipline of traditional Greek warfare with the mobility of tribal cavalry, all united by absolute loyalty to their commander. But perhaps more importantly, he had forged a new kind of leadership. He led from the front, sharing his men's hardships and risks. In battle, he wore a distinctive white-plumed helmet, making himself visible to both his troops and his enemies. This wasn't mere bravado. It was a calculated statement that leadership meant putting oneself on the line. The young prince, who had once studied heroes in Aristotle's school, was now writing his own epic. As his army crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor, they carried with them not just weapons and supplies, but a vision of empire that would reshape the ancient world. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the centuries. Alexander of Macedon was marching east, and the greatest empire of the age awaited. History, they say, is written by the victors, and few figures illustrate this truth more poignantly than Darius III. While Alexander's legend soared through the centuries, Darius has often been cast as a mere foil, the last king of a decaying empire. Yet the truth, as always, is far more complex. To understand the clash that would reshape the ancient world, we must first understand the man who bore the weight of Persia's crown. Born audacious in a branch of Persia's royal Achaemenid dynasty, Darius never expected to rule. His path to the throne was marked by the kind of palace intrigue that had become all too common in Persian royal politics. When poison and daggers claimed the lives of King Artaxerxes III and his son, the empire's powerful courtiers elevated Artashata to the throne. Taking the royal name Darius III in 336 BCE, he inherited not just a crown, but an empire at a crossroads. The Persian Empire of Darius's time was a marvel of the ancient world, stretching from the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean Sea. Its network of roads, sophisticated postal system, and complex bureaucracy had inspired awe and envy for generations. In the great palace of Persepolis, ambassadors from 100 nations brought tribute to the King of Kings. Yet beneath this glittering surface, cracks had begun to appear. Rebellious satraps, provincial governors, in far-flung provinces tested royal authority. The empire's vast size, once its greatest strength, had become a challenge to effective rule. Despite the circumstances of his ascension, Darius proved himself more capable than many expected. Standing over 6 feet tall, with a commanding presence that befitted his royal status, he worked to stabilize his massive realm. He tackled corruption among provincial governors, reorganized the empire's finances, and maintained the delicate balance of power among noble families. In an empire where appearances mattered as much as reality, Darius played his role with dignity and skill, but time was not on his side. The same year that Darius took the throne in Persepolis, the young Alexander became king in Macedonia. At first, the Persian court viewed Alexander as they had viewed his father Philip, a minor irritant on the empire's distant frontier. Reports of the young king's activities in Greece were dismissed as the squabbles of barbarians. This fatal underestimation would come back to haunt them. When Alexander crossed into Asia Minor in 334 BCE, Darius initially followed traditional Persian strategy. He dispatched local forces to deal with what he saw as a border incursion, while he gathered a larger army. It was a reasonable approach that had served Persia well for centuries. But Alexander was no ordinary invader, and his victories at Granicus and Issus shattered Persian confidence. Darius found himself facing an enemy who rewrote the rules of warfare with every battle. Yet it would be a mistake to view Darius as merely passive or incompetent. After the shocking defeat at Issus, where he was forced to flee the battlefield, leaving behind his family and royal treasures, Darius showed remarkable resilience. He offered Alexander generous peace terms, including the hand of his daughter in marriage and all the lands west of the Euphrates River. When these were rejected, he began preparing for what he knew would be a decisive confrontation. The Persian king had learned from his earlier defeats. For the Battle of Gaugamela, he carefully chose the battlefield, leveling the ground to favor his chariots and cavalry. He gathered troops from the furthest reaches of his empire, including the fearsome war elephants of India and the skilled horsemen of Bactria. He equipped his chariots with scything blades and positioned his best troops where they could strike at the Macedonian center. It was a masterful plan that showcased both his learning and his determination. If Alexander seemed to embody the future, Darius represented a different kind of greatness, the grandeur of an ancient civilization fighting to preserve its way of life. As ruler of Persia, he was more than just a king. He was the living embodiment of an imperial tradition that stretched back to Cyrus the Great, guardian of a sophisticated culture that had shaped the Near East for centuries. When he donned the royal tiara and took his place on the battlefield, he carried with him the weight of that history. The great tragedy of Darius III was not that he was an incompetent ruler, but that he faced an opponent who changed the very nature of warfare and empire. The qualities that had made Persian kings great for centuries, their ability to balance competing factions, their maintenance of traditional authority, their reliance on overwhelming numbers, proved inadequate against Alexander's revolutionary tactics and leadership. The spring of 334 BCE dawned with an act of defiance that would echo through centuries. As Alexander's army of 40,000 men crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor, the young king hurled his spear from his ship into the Asian shore, claiming the continent as won by the spear. It was a bold gesture, perhaps even arrogant, but Alexander had always understood the power of symbolism. That single spear, planted in Persian soil, marked the beginning of one of history's most remarkable military campaigns. The first test came at the Granicus River, where Persian satraps had gathered their forces to crush this invasion before it could gain momentum. The Persian position seemed impregnable. They held the high eastern bank of the river, their cavalry lined up along the ridge, while their Greek mercenary infantry waited in reserve. The rushing waters of the Granicus and the steep, muddy banks appeared to make any crossing suicidal. Alexander's veteran general, Parmenion, advised waiting, suggesting they search for an easier crossing point. "The Hellespont would blush with shame," Alexander replied, "if we crossed it only to be stopped by a stream." What followed was either brilliant madness or calculated genius. As his generals watched in horror, Alexander led his companion cavalry into the river. The Macedonian advance should have been slaughtered, but Alexander had seen something his opponents had missed. The Persian cavalry, arranged for show rather than combat, had left themselves no room to maneuver. As the Macedonians struggled up the bank, the Persian lines began to ripple and break, unable to bring their full force to bear. The battle transformed into a series of savage cavalry duels. Alexander, conspicuous in his white-plumed helmet and gleaming armor, became the focus of Persian attacks. At one point, a Persian noble's axe shattered Alexander's helmet, nearly killing him before Black Clitus severed the Persian's arm with a desperate sword stroke. But the Macedonian phalanx, fighting its way across the river, finally broke the Persian position. By day's end, the Persian force was scattered, and Alexander had secured his foothold in Asia. The victory at Granicus wasn't just a military success, it was a statement. Alexander ordered statues made of the 25 companion cavalry members who died in the initial charge, honoring them as heroes. He sent 300 captured Persian shields back to Athens as an offering to Athena, inscribed with the words, "Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks, except the Spartans, took these from the barbarians of Asia." The message was clear. This wasn't just a Macedonian conquest, but a pan-Hellenic crusade. As Alexander moved south through Asia Minor, city after city fell to him. Some resisted and were taken by force, others opened their gates willingly. But the young king was playing a longer game than simple conquest. In each Greek city previously under Persian rule, he abolished the Persian-backed oligarchies and established democracies. He kept Persian administrative systems where they worked well, retained capable local officials, and began building a government that blended Macedonian Greek, and Persian elements. But the Persian Empire wasn't finished. While Alexander consolidated his gains in Asia Minor, Darius III was gathering an army of unprecedented size. The Persian king had learned from the defeat at Granicus. This time, he would lead his forces personally. The two armies finally met near the coastal city of Issus, in a narrow plain between the mountains and the sea. It was here that Alexander and Darius would face each other for the first time, in a battle that would reshape both their destinies. The battlefield at Issus was a trap, but not the one Darius had intended. The Persian king had placed his massive army in a space too narrow to use his superior numbers effectively. Alexander, seeing the opportunity, orchestrated a masterpiece of tactical warfare. His phalanx engaged the Persian center, while his cavalry, led by Alexander himself, smashed through the Persian left. The battle devolved into chaos as Alexander's charge threatened Darius's position. The Persian king, fearing for his life, fled the field. In the royal tent, abandoned in the retreat, Alexander found Darius's family, including his mother, wife, and children. His treatment of them, with respect and courtesy, would become legendary. The victory at Issus changed everything. Alexander was no longer just a young king on a bold adventure. He was now a conqueror who had humbled the great king of Persia. But both he and Darius knew this wasn't the end. As Alexander moved south, taking the Phoenician coast in Egypt, Darius retreated east, gathering forces for what both men knew would be their final confrontation. The stage was set for the greatest battle the ancient world had ever seen. On one side, Alexander undefeated and seemingly unstoppable. On the other, Darius fighting for his empire's survival. The next time they met at Gaugamela, the fate of the ancient world would hang in the balance. Dawn broke over the plains of Gaugamela on October 1st, 331 BCE, revealing a sight that would be remembered for millennia. On the carefully leveled plain, Darius III had assembled the greatest army the ancient world had ever seen. Over 100,000 men gathered from every corner of his vast empire. Fierce Bactrian cavalry, Indian warriors with their war elephants, scythed chariots that gleamed in the morning sun, and at the center, the elite Persian immortals. Against this mighty host, Alexander's army of 47,000 must have seemed almost insignificant. The night before, Parmenion had urged Alexander to attempt a night attack, fearing the overwhelming Persian numbers. Alexander's response was characteristically bold. "I will not steal my victory." Instead, he slept soundly in his tent, so deeply that his generals had to wake him on the morning of battle. When Parmenion expressed surprise at his calmness, Alexander simply replied, "How could we not be confident? The enemy has gathered in one place all the spoils of Asia for us to capture." Darius had learned from his previous defeats. This time he had chosen the battlefield carefully, a vast plain near the village of Gaugamela, far from the confining terrain that had neutralized his numbers at Issus. His engineers had spent days leveling the ground, creating an ideal surface for his scythed chariots and cavalry. The Persian king had even distributed torches throughout his army to prevent a night attack. Everything was prepared for what he hoped would be the decisive victory that would save his empire. As the armies took their positions, the contrast between the two forces was stark. The Persian army stretched across the plain in a brilliant display of color and power. The gold and silver of noble armor, the bright standards of 100 different nations, the impressive bulk of the war elephants. The Macedonian army, by comparison, moved with quiet precision, their well-worn armor and disciplined formations speaking of years of continuous warfare. Alexander's battle plan was audacious to the point of seeming madness. Instead of matching the Persian line, he arranged his army at an angle, with his right wing advanced and his left refused. As the Persian army began to move forward, Alexander led his right wing even further to the right, threatening to move off the prepared battlefield. Darius, fearing Alexander would escape the trap he had set, ordered his left wing to extend, matching Alexander's movement. This was exactly what Alexander had anticipated. As the Persian line stretched to maintain contact, gaps began to appear in their formation. Darius, seeing his carefully arranged battle line starting to fragment, was forced to commit his reserves early, sending his scythed chariots charging forward to disrupt the Macedonian advance. The charge of the scythed chariots should have been devastating, but Alexander had prepared his men well. As the chariots thundered forward, the Macedonian line split apart into prearranged lanes, letting the deadly vehicles pass harmlessly through. Archers and javelineers picked off the drivers, while other troops hauled down the horses. The weapon that Darius had hoped would shatter the Macedonian army was neutralized with almost contemptuous ease. But the real crisis of the battle was developing on the left. Parmenion's wing was under heavy pressure from the Persian right, threatening to break entirely. Messages reached Alexander begging for reinforcement. Yet this was the crucial moment he had been waiting for. Through the gap created by the failed chariot charge, Alexander led his companion cavalry in a massive wedge formation, driving straight for the heart of the Persian army and Darius himself. The charge of the companions was like a spear thrust into the Persian center. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat at its most intense. Alexander himself was in the thick of it, his white-plumed helmet visible as he fought alongside his men. The pressure on the Persian center grew unbearable. Darius, seeing the Macedonian cavalry pushing closer and his own lines buckling, made the fateful decision to retreat. As at Issus, once the king fled, the Persian army began to dissolve. But unlike at Issus, this time Alexander couldn't immediately pursue. The situation on his left wing had become desperate, and he was forced to turn back to save Parmenion's forces from destruction. This delay allowed Darius to escape, though the Persian army itself was shattered beyond recovery. The Great Empire of Cyrus and Darius I, which had dominated the Near East for 2 centuries, effectively ended that day on the plains of Gaugamela. The aftermath of the battle revealed the completeness of Alexander's victory. The Persian capitals Babylon, Susa, and finally Persepolis itself fell into his hands, along with treasures beyond counting. The contrast between his entry into these cities was telling. Babylon welcomed him as a liberator, and he responded by respecting their ancient customs and gods. But Persepolis, the symbolic heart of Persian power, was put to the torch after a winter of celebration, a final, devastating statement that the old order had passed away forever. Darius fled eastward, hoping to raise another army in his eastern provinces, but his fate was sealed. In the summer of 330 BCE, his own subordinates, led by the satrap Bessus, betrayed him. Alexander, pursuing closely, found the great king dying by the side of the road, struck down by assassins' spears. The young conqueror covered the fallen king with his own cloak, a gesture of respect that symbolized not just the end of a rivalry, but the transfer of power from one great empire to another. In the smoldering ruins of Persepolis, as Alexander stood before the empty throne of the Persian kings, the full weight of his victory must have seemed almost unreal. In just 6 years, this young man from Macedonia had accomplished what no one thought possible: the complete conquest of the most powerful empire in the known world. But the true impact of this clash between Alexander and Darius would resonate far beyond the battlefield, shaping the course of civilization for centuries to come. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's victory transformed the ancient world overnight. The walls that had long separated East and West came crashing down. Greek culture and ideas flowed eastward along the trade routes, while Persian art, science, and customs moved west. In the great cities Alexander founded, particularly Alexandria in Egypt, this cultural fusion created something entirely new. Scholars debated in gymnasiums built next to temples of Eastern gods. Persian astronomical knowledge merged with Greek mathematics. The rigid boundaries between civilized and barbarian began to blur. Alexander's vision of empire was revolutionary. Unlike conquerors before him, he didn't seek to simply rule over different peoples. He wanted to create a new kind of civilization altogether. He encouraged his officers to marry Persian noblewomen, adopted elements of Persian court ceremony, and promoted capable locals to high positions in his government. When his Macedonian veterans complained about this Orientalization, Alexander stood firm. He understood that true empire meant more than just military domination. It required cultural synthesis. For the Persian Empire, the legacy was more complex. While Darius III's death marked the end of the Achaemenid dynasty, Persian civilization didn't disappear, it adapted. Under Alexander's successors, particularly the Seleucids, Persian administrative systems continued to function, now infused with Greek elements. The Persian language remained important. Persian art influenced Greek styles, and Persian religious ideas spread westward. Even after Alexander's empire fractured, this cultural fusion continued to evolve. The military impact was equally profound. Alexander's campaigns revolutionized warfare. His integration of cavalry and infantry, his emphasis on speed and mobility, and his ability to adapt tactics to terrain became a template studied by generals for generations. From Hannibal to Caesar, from Saladin to Napoleon, military commanders would look to Alexander's battles for inspiration. The Battle of Gaugamela, in particular, became a textbook example of how superior tactics and leadership could overcome overwhelming numbers. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was philosophical. The clash between Alexander and Darius posed questions that remain relevant today. How should different cultures interact? What makes an empire legitimate? Can military conquest lead to positive cultural exchange? What qualities define great leadership? Alexander's attempt to create a unified empire that respected and incorporated different cultures was revolutionary for its time, and remains a challenging ideal even now. The personal legacies of the two leaders stand in sharp contrast. Alexander became legend, his name synonymous with unequaled success and boundless ambition. Cities, generals, and kings would bear his name for centuries to come. His image as the young, undefeated conqueror who dreamed of uniting the world became an archetype that would inspire leaders throughout history. Darius III's legacy is more nuanced. While often portrayed as merely the loser in Alexander's great story, his resistance to overwhelming odds and his efforts to hold together a diverse empire deserve recognition. His final moments, betrayed by his own men but treated with respect by his greatest enemy, capture the tragic nobility of a ruler who fought to preserve his civilization even as the world changed around him. The story of Alexander and Darius reminds us that history's greatest moments often come not just from the clash of armies, but from the collision of different visions of the world. Alexander's dream of a unified empire where Greek and Persian cultures could merge was ahead of its time. Though his own empire fragmented after his death, the Hellenistic civilization that emerged from his conquest would flourish for centuries, creating a cultural legacy that influenced everything from art and philosophy to religion and science. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, just 9 years after crossing into Asia, he left behind more than just a vast conquered territory. He left a transformed world where the old boundaries, geographic, cultural, and intellectual, had been erased. The ancient rivalry between East and West had given way to a new vision of civilization, one that valued cultural exchange over separation, integration over dominance. Today, as we grapple with questions of cultural interaction, leadership, and the nature of power, the story of Alexander and Darius III remains surprisingly relevant. Their clash reminds us that history's most significant changes often come not from the destruction of the old order, but from the creative synthesis that follows. In their story, we see not just the end of an ancient empire, but the birth of a new way of thinking about human civilization, one that continues to influence our world today.